Hi, I'm Shashank Bhargav, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. In this episode, we talk about how anti-cattle slaughter laws can be disastrous for dairy farmers. We also take a quick look at over 100 students in IIT Madras testing positive for COVID-19. But first, we talk about the problem of child malnutrition. Last week, the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare released what was the first phase data from the 2019 to 2020 National Family Health Survey, or NFHS. NFHS is perhaps the most important survey done on health and family welfare in the country. It is based on this survey's data that a lot of national and state level policies are formed. The latest data, that is the phase 1, only pertains to 17 states in the country, including Maharashtra, Bihar, and West Bengal, and 5 union territories, including J&K. And the data captures what the state of health was in these states before the COVID-19 pandemic struck. The phase 2 of the survey, which will cover other states like Uttar Pradesh, Punjab, and Madhya Pradesh, was delayed due to the pandemic, and its results are expected to be made available next year in May. Now, in phase 1 of the data, one major problem that has surfaced is of child malnutrition. This survey shows that several states across the country, like Telangana, Kerala, Bihar, and Assam, have reversed course and have recorded worsening levels of child malnutrition in children under the age of 5. And this has happened despite drastic improvements in sanitation and better access to fuel and drinking water. In this segment, we speak to Purnima Menon about the survey. Menon is a senior research fellow at the International Food Policy Research Institute and directs POSHAN, which is an initiative to support more use of evidence for nutrition in India. And she says that while the survey comes as a disappointment, she wasn't entirely surprised by it.
And I'll tell you why. So the data were collected in 2019. And the period preceding that was quite a difficult time from an economic perspective, with the economic shocks that occurred as well as the sort of general slowdown. And usually an economic slowdown is never good for child malnutrition.
Although India is in a recession right now, India's economy had been slowing down even before the COVID-19 pandemic hit. The last financial year had ended with a growth rate of just 4%, and before the lockdown, unemployment was already at a 4-decade high. All of which, like Menon says, are correlated to lower levels of child malnutrition. But the other thing she points out is that the National Nutrition Mission, also called Poshan Abhiyan, was also only launched in 2018.
And so, in a sense, sort of the nationwide visibility to the issue of malnutrition happened a little bit later in this period that is the reference period, if you will, for this data collection, right? So if you're collecting data in 2019 on children under 5, many of those children were actually born before sort of the high emphasis and high visibility nutrition mission kicked in. So I think for me, right now, those are the sort of two leading interpretations that I'm going with.
Now, in the data, one surprising reversal was that of child stunting, which refers to the percentage of children who have low height for their age. It reflects chronic undernutrition and is likely to have long-lasting adverse effects on both the cognitive and physical development of a child. When we speak to Menon about this, she says that it is rather uncommon for this to happen.
It's actually pretty unprecedented. We don't see it in a lot of places. And usually it does indicate, that there is something underlying that increase in stunting it's a great signal of trouble. And I think, I have a colleague at IFPRI who talks about, childhood stunting as being the smoke alarm, but you have to identify the source of the fire. And I think in this case, that's going to take some digging, and it's going to have to be done state by state. I'm quite heartened by the fact that, states that were not doing very well earlier, like Bihar, there has been quite a substantial decrease in child stunting. So, obviously something good was happening there, or perhaps, the nature of Bihar's economy was that it wasn't buffeted by some of the shocks that were affecting other parts. So I think there's a lot of analysis to do. It's a little early to offer sort of firm interpretations, but I know that, we have learned a lot from studying improvements and success cases in stunting between 2006 and 16 that will help us to analyze what has likely happened in this preceding period.
India has had a problem of child malnutrition for a while now. For example, the country has the largest number of stunted children in the world and has consistently ranked poorly in the Global Hunger Index. In the 2020 index, it ranked 94th out of 107 countries. Menon says that one major obstacle in tackling this problem has been that even though we have known that the problem is multifaceted, the strategy to deal with it was only under one program. And that was the Integrated Child Development Services, or ICDS, a government program that caters to the nutrition, health, and pre-education needs of children till 6 years of age, as well as the health and nutrition of women and adolescent girls.
So when you understand that a problem is caused by many different things, the solutions that are deployed have to address all of those things that we have understood to be challenges, right? But in fact, the solution space has been primarily focused around the ICDS. And this is historical, it has nothing to do with what's happening right now. I mean, in many ways, the nutrition mission that is in place right now recognizes the multi-sectorality, but has also brought in additional sectors. But I think we still haven't fully recognized, how important it is to resolve some hard underlying determinants, and the nutrition improvement strategy has not aligned with the poverty reduction strategy.
She says that countries that have managed to improve child nutrition levels, their strategy has involved tackling both poverty and food insecurity, and reaching out to houses where nutrition is a problem. In India, she says, this is recognized, but the coupling has not been strong enough. When we talk about nutrition, food security is obviously a big part. But food security doesn't just mean the availability of food, which depends on agriculture and market systems. Menon explains that it is also about access and utilization.
The access is a big issue, and there are now quite a few pieces of analysis that have highlighted that there are sort of strong cost-related constraints, so that the cost of achieving a nutritious diet, even if foods are available, can be quite out of reach for a majority of people. So that's the access piece of it. And then finally, on the utilization, that is where, for example, nutrition intersects with infections and things like that. So if you have, populations where you have traditionally high levels of infectious disease and other such things, then, your need for the ability of the food that you consume to actually help support healthy growth, et cetera, is going to be more compromised, right? So there is that whole spectrum of issues to consider. And, the policy or program efforts have sort of tackled each of those in different ways. Food and food security are very important. I mean, at the end of the day, people, mothers and children have to eat healthy, nutritious foods to grow and thrive. And so if those healthy, nutritious foods are either not available or not accessible, or if even upon consuming them, you have a body that has health challenges and therefore you can't respond, you're going to see the impacts of that, right? So the actions have to sort of consider that full spectrum, certainly.
Now, one question to consider is that what does it take to improve nutrition levels in a country like India? And what kind of programs end up making an impact? Menon says that their team has been studying both global and sub-national successes. They have looked at states like Orissa, Chhattisgarh, Gujarat, and Tamil Nadu very closely. And she says what has worked for these states is a focused, multifaceted approach, where you have programs designed to improve, among other things, public health measures, household incomes, and the delivery of basic health intervention for children who are under 1,000 days old, a period which is particularly vulnerable.
And then last but not least, they also had social safety net programs. And, so these were also actually all 4 states also had fairly, substantial state level economic growth. But then also there was a shoring up and a strengthening of social welfare programs. So whether it was strengthening the PDS, putting in place additional cash transfers, all of those things. So these states sort of had these common features. Now, there are also some quite interesting common features when it comes to saying what makes the implementation of some of these programs successful. And there we found that one of the most important things was actually having very capable and stable leadership for public sector programs. So in states that had done well on nutrition, they had senior bureaucrats and technical folks inside their programs who were really empowered and very capable and had actually been given a lot of space to work on improving their programs. And many of them stayed in their positions for a few years.
She says that improving programs and their governance takes time, especially because most bureaucrats in India are generalist bureaucrats.
Which means they need to come into a sector, they need to understand the sector and the programs and learn quickly and then deploy a set of solutions to challenges that may be identified. And then it's best if they're also there to see the results of the solutions that they deploy. So that's another key feature. We actually were able to see sort of longer bureaucratic tenure, but also a lot of very capable people had been appointed. And what that means is that the sector or the issue had been recognized as being very important politically. Because in terms of the appointments to, who are the principal secretaries of health, of WCD, and other such things in these states, they've all had very capable bureaucrats.
And she says it is because of the appointment of such bureaucrats that programs work much better. They know how to identify problems, bring in partners, and even tackle the corruption in the system. But she says that there is another factor common in all the different success stories, and that is that they are not afraid of evidence.
I mean, we are researchers at the end of the day. I'm a researcher, my colleagues are researchers. And for us, it's really, it's very interesting and very rewarding to work with state governments and with counterparts who value evidence, who are like, okay, that's fine. You tell us that program is not working because we want to know that things are working. And that's a very interesting, I guess, a cultural mindset, but it's a very positive mindset for improving your programs, looking at your own data, bringing in research partners and things like that. So I think there's a range of different things there that, have happened within systems that have seen success within the context of India. And many of them are totally replicable.
Now, talking about the latest NFHS data, we have mentioned how several states have worsened in child malnutrition. At the same time, it is also important to note that on factors like the infant mortality rate, that is the number of deaths per live births for children under the age of 1, things are mostly stagnant. This, of course, is also connected to nutrition because, as Menon points out, over 60% of child mortality is explained by poor nutrition. The latest NFHS survey captures data during the first 5 years of the Modi government and therefore does not include the lockdown. We asked Menon if this means that things are only set to worsen.
I wish I could be optimistic, but I think it's going to be, it's going to be tough. And I say that with a strong recognition that the government and the folks that are implementing the health and nutrition programs have done a lot to restore services. So I think the restoration of program services is actually well on way already. We have seen that, we are seeing that in the administrative data from the health system that is publicly available. We are seeing that from some research that we and others are doing on the ground. So there are things that are being done to restore what is happening under, the health and nutrition services and, to adapt social safety net programs and other such things. But the big question is always, is it going to be enough to mitigate the impacts that people have faced? And, the small studies that have emerged on things like food security and livelihood impacts suggest that there is going to be quite a challenge on that front.
She also says that we need to have a large-scale effort to understand the effects of the pandemic and that it has to be systematic.
Too many of the insights that are coming out in terms of the impacts of the pandemic and the economic impacts and all of that, they're coming from a patchwork of pieces of research that different people are doing. And they're pointing collectively to a picture that is quite sobering. But it's not, nationally representative. It's not state representative. It's not government-owned data necessarily, although they are, actively listening to what researchers are finding. So I think a bit of an effort to, just sort of do some very streamlined and very rapid data collection with high frequency will tell us a lot about, what are the kinds of things that are happening on the ground. And then one has to reckon with that and see whether the policy instruments we have in our hands can actually be deployed to address those gaps.
Dear listeners, before we move on to the rest of the show, I just wanted your quick attention. One of the big reasons people say they like this show is because it helps them understand the news better. It provides them with the context they need to see the bigger picture. And there is perhaps no other place that does that better than Indian Express's Explained section. We on Three Things refer to the section regularly, and it helps us make this show. If you're a regular reader of Indian Express, you know how useful the Explained section can be, especially when you're looking for in-depth analysis by the right experts. You can log on to indianexpress.com/explained and access the coverage 24/7. Explained by Indian Express, where news that matters is explained by experts who know the subject. Now, back to the show. And next, we talk about anti-slaughter laws. Last week, Karnataka became the latest BJP-ruled state to pass a stringent anti-cattle slaughter bill in its assembly. The bill, however, could not in the end be approved by the Legislative Council before the session got over. But the government in the state has now said that it would bring in an ordinance to implement the provisions of the bill. In India, anti-slaughter laws which ban the killing of different kinds of cattle are passed due to the divine status accorded to cows and cattle by the Hindu community. And they appear to be getting more and more strict. But it's important to note that it's not just BJP-ruled states that have them.
Actually, all states, most states, barring maybe Kerala and Northeast and West Bengal, had anti-slaughter laws in some form or the other.
That's Harish Damodaran, Indian Express's rural affairs editor. And he explains that while a lot of states have had them, the difference now is the enforcement of the law.
Earlier, most states never really implemented it. And as far as the law is concerned, I think the difference came first with the Maharashtra legislation in 2015. The Maharashtra law for the first time made it illegal to slaughter even male cattle, that is bullocks, bulls, and male calves, in addition to cows. I think Maharashtra made that particular jump, moving from the cow to also the male cattle. And Karnataka has taken this one step further to also include buffaloes, So now you have not just the cow and its progeny, whether it is male and female cattle, but also buffaloes, which I think takes it one step more.
The biggest difference between BJP and non-BJP states is still enforcement, he says. Moreover, this enforcement has not just been through government, but also through various other bodies and cow vigilantes, that is, Gau Rakshaks. In fact, back in 2017, the data journalism website India Spent had done a content analysis and found that over a 7-year period, 28 people were killed and 124 were injured in cow-related violence. And even though these incidents appear to have accelerated since 2010, Harish says India has had laws against cattle slaughter for some time now.
Right from independence onwards, the protection of the cow and its progeny was always part of the directive principles of state policy, And to that extent, many states had sort of put it on their statutes, but nobody seriously implemented it. But now we are seeing not just implementation of the existing laws, but also a tightening of the laws, like bringing in bulls and bullocks and also now buffaloes. I think that is a real difference between now and then.
And even though the stated purpose of these laws seems to be the preservation of cattle, Harish says that that is not what ends up happening. In fact, these laws pose a significant threat to the dairy industry. And to explain this, Harish first talks about why Indian farmers have historically kept cattle.
As far as the male cattle were concerned, you needed these male cattle basically for the purposes of having bulls. Okay, you needed bulls for breeding. Generally, in every village, you would have a few bulls, which farmers kept basically for breeding purposes, for mating their cows and producing calves. But now with artificial insemination, farmers don't need to maintain bulls. Okay, because you now have actually frozen semen coming from bull stations which are very far away. Nowadays you have cows which may be, say, in Assam, which are getting inseminated by frozen semen brought from, say, the Sabarmati Ashram Goshala near Anand, which is a facility of the National Dairy Development Board.
The point being that you don't need bulls for breeding. And the other point is that the bulls which were castrated were drought animals,
which were used to not just plow the field, but also to do threshing, also to lift water from the wells, But now all these have got mechanized, you have tractors, okay? You have the harvester combines for doing the threshing and for harvesting. And you have either the diesel engine or you have the electric tube wells for pulling in water. And same thing, even bullock carts have slowly given way to the tractor. So male animals are now almost redundant. I mean, it's not that they've disappeared, but generally farmers don't consider the male cattle as a burden.
Moreover, he points out that because of chemical fertilizers, you don't need dung either. That's another reason not to keep male cattle. So farmers now keep cattle purely for milk purposes. Harish explains the economics of how that system works.
So suppose I were to rear, say, a crossbred cow. A crossbred cow will, say 1.5 years, it comes to puberty and it is ready for insemination. And you add another about 9 months. So the first calving will happen when it is about 27, 28 months, and then it will start producing milk. So farmers will generally keep a cow for, say, maximum maybe about, for about 5-6 lactation. So by then already, it is already 7 to 8 years old. After that, the farmer doesn't need that cow, So typically what a farmer does is he'll sell off that cow and then he will use that money as capital to invest in new cows. So this is how the farmer he keeps rotating his herd, So there is a herd replacement, like if I have 10 animals, I get 2 animals outside the system. Now, who's buying these animals, whether it is buffaloes or whether it is cows? Obviously, they're not being bought for yielding milk because by then already they have completed their lactation cycles. The milk yields will definitely come down. So most of these actually go for slaughter.
And he says that there is a market for this, which includes people who consume beef and buffalo meat.
In the case of buffalo meat, actually, a lot of it goes for exports. I think India earns something like $4 billion from export of buffalo meat. In fact, I think India is one of the world's largest exporter of bovine meat, And of course, cow meat is not exported. So I think there were already, systems in place. So these laws just existed on paper, I mean, it was just sort of a wink, wink kind of a thing. Nobody took these things seriously and it's not possible to implement. How can you force a farmer to keep his cow even if it has stopped giving milk? And today with urea, with DAP, etc., you don't need to keep them even for the purpose of manure. And at the same time, the farmer cannot afford to spend 100 rupees, 125 rupees every day on feeding an animal which is not yielding any returns.
And for farmers, he says, economics comes first. But with anti-slaughter laws like the ones that Karnataka is planning to implement, which bans even the killing of buffaloes, Harish says that is going to be disastrous for farmers.
I don't think UP is going to implement this, that is a slaughter of buffaloes because in fact, in North India, you will find more buffaloes than cows. Farmers keep buffaloes. And the reason is simply because it's easier to dispose of. No Gorakshak is going to come and sit on me, So the ease of disposal is what is making farmers in Uttar Pradesh, in many of these states to go more and more for buffaloes, which may not be the best thing actually, in the long run.
These laws, in effect, disincentivize dairy farmers from keeping cattle, because there is potential for harassment later on from sources like fringe right-wing groups.
Even if the farmer wants to sell, there's nobody who will come and take these animals which are unproductive from the farmer's perspective, right? So if nobody is going to take these animals, what is the farmer going to do? So every year, if the number of the productive animals are going to just keep increasing, he will not be able to maintain these animals. And ultimately, cattle are going to be reared by farmers, right? We in cities are not going to rear them, right? So even if you want to ensure that farmers keep cattle, you need to have some kind of policy on culling, and maybe it makes sense that you don't allow slaughter of pure indigenous breeds, which are our real desi cattle. You can have a ban maybe on slaughter of Sahiwal, Gir, Ongol, Tharparkar, which are our pure breeds.
Breeds which are indigenous and considered holy. That way, you allow space for religious sentiment, he says, and also accommodate for culling of, say, buffaloes, crossbreeds, and the Western cattle breeds.
If culling doesn't happen, then dairy farming will become unviable and India will turn a milk powder importer. Surely, I don't think any sane policy maker would want India to become an importer of milk powder and butter oil from New Zealand or Europe, right? I mean, ultimately, there is a cost to, these kind of policies, right?
And in Karnataka, once the new anti-slaughter law is implemented, Harish says the state is going to see a rise in stray cattle.
Farmers will definitely let loose these animals, whether we like it or not. And they'll make their way definitely to Bangalore, maybe, in the IT parks and all these places. Because farmers, by no means, they're going to keep them. Definitely. I mean, and it happens to be that in Karnataka, most of the milk, you have a very good milk cooperative there, Nandini. Most of the procurement is in the Bangalore, Mysore area. The best milk unions there are in places like Mandya, Bangalore, Hassan, and so these places are not very far away from Bangalore, so probably they'll all be just let loose,
And it is the Bangalore citizen who will have to face the brunt of this. The other important thing to note is that one can see the impact of the aggressive anti-slaughter laws in the official livestock census data. Between 2012 and 2019, Uttar Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, Gujarat, and Maharashtra, which until a year ago was also a BJP-ruled state, saw the cattle populations go down. These are the states which saw a stricter enforcement of anti-slaughter laws. On the other hand, according to the 2019 census, the state of West Bengal overtook Uttar Pradesh as India's #1 cattle state.
It's ironical that today the maximum cattle population now is in West Bengal, and that state allows slaughter. So you could very well have a situation where you may find more cattle in maybe Kerala, West Bengal, Northeast. They'll all go there, whereas the so-called cow belt may have only buffaloes.
And in the end, we talk about IIT Madras. The campus of IIT Madras has been placed under temporary lockdown after 104 students and staff members of the institution tested positive for coronavirus. The State Health Department and IIT management are yet to identify the source of the outbreak. As per local reports, the students had claimed that there had been overcrowding in the hostel mess and that could have led the infection to spread. This is one of the biggest clusters that has emerged in Chennai after the state government permitted educational institutions to function from December 7. Following the outbreak, the institution has decided to close all departments temporarily, including all the centers, labs, and library. In a press release, the IIT management said that the institute has been functioning on limited capacity with only 10% students in the hostels. As soon as a spurt in symptomatic cases was reported by some students residing in the hostels, the institute has consulted the civic authorities and has arranged for all students residing in hostels to be tested for COVID-19. To be cautious, all students have been asked to remain in their rooms and packed food is being supplied to the students in their hostels. According to the officials, a total of 700 students are currently staying on the campus, and they are accommodated across 9 hostels, with less than 20% capacity occupied in each of them. You were listening to 3 Things by The Indian Express. Today's show was written and produced by me, Shashank Bhargav, and as always was edited and mixed by our producer Joshua Thomas. Before we go, here's another reminder to check out Indian Express's Explain section. You can log on to indianexpress.com/explain and find in-depth analysis by the right experts. It has everything you need to know to understand the news better and see the bigger picture. If you like this show, then you can subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it, share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can also tweet us at Express Audio and write to us at podcast@indianexpress.com.